Hello everybody and welcome to my home. I'm making this video to go over some things I wasn't able to go over in class this week. Hopefully it's a quick video, but there are about 3 or 4 things that I want to cover. First, I want to explain some basics of argumentation. For this part of the recording, you should refer to handout number 1, which I've made on Blackboard. Second, I want to go over the positions of the free will debate, and mainly I want to present a flow chart that I've made that might help some of you understand those positions better. Third, I want to make some quick comments about the scientific explanation argument that I presented in class, but now with the understanding of the basics of argumentation, which is the first thing I'm going to go over today. And lastly, I want to present some objections to Dolbach's argument for determinism that I wasn't able to cover in class. So hopefully I can do those 4 pretty quickly. So first, I want to go over some basics of argumentation. For this, you'll need to refer to handout 1, which is available on Blackboard. So if you don't have that in front of you, do that right now. Pause this video and go do that. Okay. So in class I introduced the notion of an argument. Now the word argument has a certain kind of meaning in common language. If you go to a bar, you're with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, or you have arguments all the time. In philosophy we have arguments, but the kinds of arguments we have are not the kinds of arguments that you would typically think of. Rather, arguments in the philosophical sense are a set of statements that are aimed to convince somebody to believe a certain or a particular conclusion. So if I'm giving you an argument, I'm presenting you a set of statements that together are aimed to make you believe some conclusion that I want you to believe. Now, there are 2 kinds of statements in an argument. 1, an argument is composed of premises, and 2, an argument is composed of conclusions. The conclusion is what an argument is trying to get you to believe. The premises are reasons for believing the conclusion of an argument. So as I showed you in class, an argument is laid out as a set of statements. The statements labeled P, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, are premises. They're intended to be reasons for believing that C, the conclusion, is true. So if I have a good argument, my premises are good reasons to believe the conclusion. But if I have a bad argument, my premises are not good reasons to believe the conclusion. So now if you look at your handout, on handout 1, I've called it the basics of evaluating arguments. The basics of how to tell whether arguments are good or bad. And there are 2 words here that we need to understand. Validity and soundness. Now, validity and soundness are properties or qualities of arguments. So an argument can be valid or it can be invalid. Those are the opposing terms. Or an argument can be sound or unsound. Now, validity and soundness apply to arguments, but statements of which arguments are composed, for example, a premise is a statement or a conclusion is a statement, statements cannot be valid or invalid, and neither can statements be sound or unsound. Rather, statements can be true or false. So when I tell you this argument is valid or invalid, you shouldn't confuse that with thinking that a statement is valid or invalid. A premise, for example, is true or false, but not valid or invalid or sound or unsound. So right now we're talking about validity and soundness. So I have as a definition of those 2 terms on the page. First definition, an argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for its conclusion to be false, given that its premises are true. So when you assess an argument for validity, what you're doing is you're looking at the premises of the argument and the conclusion of the argument. You've come across a valid argument if when you suppose all the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Or in other words, you come across a valid argument when you suppose all the premises are true and the conclusion must be true. So if you look at the example argument or the sample argument number 1 here, the conclusion here is, therefore Socrates will die, or has already died. And the premises are, all human beings die, Socrates is or was a human being, and conclusion, therefore Socrates will die. Now in this argument, if you assume the two premises are true, if it's true that all human beings die and Socrates is a human, well, Socrates must die. In this case, there's no way for the conclusion of this argument to be false if the premises are true. And that's good enough for the argument to be valid. That's a valid argument. Now let's move on to sound. So the second definition I have on the page, an argument is sound if and only if it is valid and its premises are in fact true. So notice that the notion of soundness includes validity, but also more. So this first argument here, it's valid because if the premises were true, the conclusion must be true. But now we can ask whether the argument is sound, and when we do that, we're asking whether the premises are actually true. Is it really true that all human beings die? And is it really true that Socrates was a human being? The answer is yes, it seems to me. So therefore the conclusion must be true, and actually is true because the premises are true. Therefore this argument is a sound argument. So argument 1 is both valid and sound. But now look at argument, let's look at argument 4. Argument 4 says, if there have been UFO sightings, then aliens exist. Premise 2, there have been many UFO sightings. Conclusion, therefore aliens exist. We first want to ask whether this argument is valid. So in order to find out whether an argument is valid, we have to assume the premises are true and see if the conclusion must be true, or see if the conclusion can be false. If we assume the premises are true and the conclusion can be false, then it's an invalid argument. So is this argument valid or invalid? Well, if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, because premise 1 says, if there have been many UFO sightings, then aliens must exist. Well, there have been UFO sightings, so aliens must exist. So therefore, this argument is valid. But now, if we want to ask whether this argument is sound or unsound, we need to ask whether all the premises are true. Is premise 1 true? Is it true that if there have been UFO sightings, then aliens exist? Premise 1 is not true. There can be many UFO sightings without it being true that aliens exist, so that statement is false. But now if that statement is false, the argument cannot be sound, because a sound argument is a valid one and the premises are true. But since premise 1 is false, argument 4 is unsound, even though it's valid. So as an exercise, you might want to look at arguments 2 and 3 and see if you can determine whether the arguments are valid or unsound. So here I've made a flow chart of the different positions on the free will debate, and hopefully this helps some of you. Now, the question that defines the free will debate is it possible to have free will? You either believe it's possible or it's impossible. The positions, 3 positions are on the bottom. A soft determinist is here, hard determinist here, libertarian position here. But as I've given you the 3 questions that define the debate, we can see how your answer to those questions will lead you to either of these positions. So you start off with the question, is it possible to have free will? The next question you might ask is whether free will and determinism are compatible or not. If you think they're compatible, that causal determinism for human actions and free will can coexist, then you're a compatibilist. If you think they're incompatible, you're an incompatibilist. But now we might ask a further question. Is determinism true? Now, if you're an incompatibilist and you think determinism is true, then you must think that free will is false. Again, because you think that the two can't exist together. So therefore, if you believe causal determinism is true as an incompatibilist, you think that it's impossible to have free will. And that's why you're a hard determinist. On the other hand, if you're an incompatibilist and you think that determinism is not true, then for you it's still possible to have free will. Now, libertarians don't only believe it's possible that we have free will, they believe we actually have free will. So therefore, they think determinism is false. But I've labeled this position libertarian anyway. Now, let's switch over to the other side. If you're a compatibilist and you believe that determinism is true, well, since you think free will and determinism can coexist, you think it's possible to have free will. But in this case, you're a soft determinist because you want both free will and determinism and not just determinism. Now, it is conceivable that you're a compatibilist and you think determinism is not true, and therefore you think it's possible to have free will, and maybe you think we have free will, but you don't think that's determinism. Now, this position is not really one that's argued for by philosophers, because if philosophers are arguing for compatibilism, they're arguing because they want both, not because they only want free will. So this position is kind of left open. But notice here, we started with this initial question about the possibility of free will. We asked this question about compatibility of determinism and free will. Then we asked the question whether determinism is true, and we have the possible positions. The main three being represented by the soft determinist, the hard determinist, and the libertarian. So hopefully that helps some of you.